American pop culture's perceptions of war have followed the same cycles throughout the years. There are moments of peace that predate each war or conflict, and during the onset of the war, you can see more patriotism and calls for interventionism. You can see more highlights of the ideals that Americans should be proud of during this time, and the goal is more about unity than in any other part of the cycle. Then, as America enters the war, things shift into propaganda mode. And I do mean in all sense of the word to push for people to support the war effort by buying war bonds or recycling, but this also does lead to the depiction of the enemies of the United States as grotesque monsters who aren't even human. While these depictions do have their place in the history books, and they're certainly not just an American thing, I do not feel comfortable showing them on my channel. Yet, they are hard to avoid, so I will have to be showing a few. However, I can make my point by showing how Captain America fought a recognizable Adolf Hitler before the attacks on Pearl Harbor, compared to the monstrous look of Red Skull during the war. And I'd really like to say that these depictions of the other ended with World War II, but no. When the war comes to an end, most of society skips ahead to the peace phase, but not the veterans who live with this trauma for the rest of their lives. You can see the anti-war themes play out in Eddie Schmidt remarks, All Quiet on the Western Front, after the author's own experiences with physical and mental trauma in the trenches of World War I, after returning to a world that was falling for the exact same blind nationalist trappings that he fell for, and they were heading down that path again. Or the novel To Hell and Back, the memoir of Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier in U.S. history, where he goes into his times of World War II and spends much of the book waxing poetically about his lost friends. That story was made into a movie starring Murphy himself, but it was watered down and sanitized for an audience. And it's not all doom and gloom either. The three-time Academy Award-winning director Frank Capra felt like he had something to prove to his adoptive country and served during World War II. His first film back is a frank and honest look for its time at depression and suicidal ideation, yet the film leaves the audience with a powerful message. It's a wonderful life. The stories are told, the wounds begin to heal, and we reach that era of peace at last. Nowhere can the effects of war on artistic expression be more pronounced than with comic books. To begin the story of how war changed comics, it's important to note that many of the Golden Age heroes were already having a few good years of issues before the war started over at Timely Comics, now known today as Marvel, and at National Comics, now known today as DC or DC Comics, if you don't mind that DC stands for Detective Comics. But this story begins with Germany invading Poland in September 1939, and Europe soon found itself enveloped in the Second World War. For the most part, the American government tried to stay out of it. But two Jewish men, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, saw what was going on overseas and knew America would someday be brought into that war. They created Captain America, and it was released a whole 9 months before the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Both men would soon be drafted into the war, with Jack Kirby using his artistic talents to draw maps with the Scouts, and even landing at Normandy shortly after D-Day. He was even awarded the Bronze Star for single-handedly holding off a unit of German tanks on a bridge in Metz, France. By this time, though, new writers came in, and as mentioned before, this is when the use of propaganda in comic books reached its heights. Since children typically don't have large sums of money to just outright buy war bonds, the publishers came up with a system where kids would send in war stamps at 10 cents each. And after that page reached $10, they got a war bond! Yay! The stories around these times saw superheroes usually leave their cities and join the men on the front lines. Superman could easily take down a single U-boat by himself, and Batman, who had already established himself as having the no-killing rule, especially no killing with guns, all of that was dropped when it came time to join the war. It should also be very much noted that these stories were written by civilians back home whose entire idea of war came from other depictions of war. There is no nuance or gray areas in these comics. While I should say that the American involvement in World War II was a just and noble war, it is weird seeing child-friendly characters like the Human Torch fry Nazis, and Namor enjoying himself while he's drowning Japanese soldiers. Also, canonically in Marvel Comics, the Human Torch burns Hitler to death, and this is actually solidified in the lore many times later on down the road. Just a weird little comic book fact that would make Quentin Tarantino smile. When the war ended in 1945, superhero comics took a step back in favor of other genres like the westerns, romance, horrors, and comedy comics. But the shift wasn't sustainable, and comic books began to see themselves as a fad. And one of the few stories that I can find of an actual World War II veteran writing about his experiences in comic form in this time period was Dave Breger's magazine strips Private Breger, where he came up with the term G.I. Joe. Not the Hasbro licensed term, but I will get into them in a bit, but the colloquial term used by troops to describe themselves that became the toy line later in the 60s and beyond. During the quiet period of the Golden Age, the Korean War came and went in 1950 to 1953, but the Flash brought in the Silver Age shortly after, and the veterans of World War II and the Korean War can now finally tell their stories on the page in a far more accurate manner. It's not about the fighting, but it's the emotional journey that's hard to describe to others. We got Charlton Comics' Fighting Army, DC's Blackhawks, but most importantly, Our Army at War, written by World War II veteran Robert Kanigher and illustrated by Korean War veteran Joe Kubert. This series was a masterclass in how to work within the hyper-restrictive Comic Code Authority, like one of the stories in the first issue, Dig Your Foxhole Deep. It was about two unnamed American soldiers needing to stay quiet as unseen Japanese soldiers surround them in the darkness. One GI dies trying to save his comrade by jumping on a grenade, but the Japanese surround the foxhole and the remaining soldier eventually succumbs to his wounds. But it actually ends with one of the superiors coming in the morning, not saying that they're both dead. He scolds them for being quiet. These comics weren't sugarcoating anything. War isn't pretty. Those in command aren't always deserving. The enemy isn't a grotesque monster, they're just someone else fighting for a different cause, and there aren't always happy storybook endings. In issue number 53, the most critical response of how the war is viewed by the comic book industry, pop culture, and civilians at large, comes in the story The Rock and the Wall. The eventual titular hero, Sergeant Rock, encounters Private Wall, an overconfident braggart who views war in such a naive way. The young, dumb soldier ridicules his superior for not just jumping into the fray like he's some sort of superhero or whatever. Sergeant Rock is brave, but he's also more intelligent. Wall gets himself shot trying to play hero, and Sergeant Rock comes to the rescue. As Private Wall regrets every decision he made along the way, Sergeant Rock lets him have his hero moment and assists him to the 50 cal to shoot down the enemy plane. We finally find ourselves back in the era of peace until the US is slowly beginning to be dragged into the Vietnam War. Captain America returns from the ice, Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos make their debut, but in my opinion, no character truly represents a war against the communist North Vietnamese in comic books quite like Iron Man. In the heights of the Cold War, a genius billionaire Nepo baby who profited off of war goes overseas to consult on a weapons contract in North Vietnam, but is critically wounded and captured by a local warlord. But to escape, he creates his suit with the help of Professor Yinsen, and he kills every communist in sight. And the cycle of hyper-depictions of war is back. Case in point, Iron Man's main villain at the time was the Mandarin from communist China, and they reverted back to the grotesque depictions of the enemy. After the Vietnam War ended with the American withdrawal in 1973 and the subsequent fall of Saigon in 1975, the Vietnam War was an unpopular war, to put it mildly, and it would take many years for Vietnam veterans to properly be able to tell their stories. It is worth noting that the Punisher was created in 1974 as a Vietnam War veteran who just couldn't leave the war behind and was a foil to the more morally correct heroes of the time, which is not a great depiction of a veteran with PTSD. But it wasn't until he got his own solo run where he was finally given more issues to flesh out his character. And just like Iron Man, the two would actually shift their timelines around to be more relevant to the rest of the wars, both eventually becoming products of the Persian Gulf War and the Afghanistan War. And here's where we finally get veterans telling their stories to a main publisher. In particular, the works of Doug Murray in the comic book series The Nam, which was praised by the Bravo organization as the best media portrayal of the Vietnam War, even beating out Oliver Stone's Platoon. It focused solely on the experiences of the individual soldier from the start of the war to the end, even releasing the issues monthly as the time in the story would also move along by 1 month. It also had appearances by the Punisher, which codified Frank Castle's experience as a veteran. The Nam deserves all of the recognition that it earned, but if I'm being honest, one of the best depictions of war that can actually be shown to a child is actually Larry Hama's G.I. Joe. Not exactly the cartoon, but the comic book it was based off of. The series pulled no punches. It was critical of the government. Fellow soldiers died. It tackled the casual racism that Larry Hama himself experienced in the army. Sure, it was a corporate loophole around the marketing of toys towards children, and no other writer wanted to touch it with a 10-foot stick, but hey, it gave him the free rein to write it exactly how he wanted to write it, with the only notes ever being like, make sure they stay within their single outfit for toy reasons. And that show then went on to dominate 80s pop culture. The dark era of the 80s was pretty light on war topics outside of Alan Moore's The Watchmen, and then the fall of the Soviet Union meant that Russians were no longer the typical bad guy for a while. With occasional mentions of the conflicts going on at the time, that's about it. This is until the terrorist attacks on 9/11. In comic books, the single issue most closely involving the attacks was The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, number 36. It is also known as the Black Issue. Peter Parker stands in Ground Zero after the towers fell. While the issue does shine a light on the heroes of the first responders and the fire department of the city of New York, NYPD, and the doctors and the nurses of EMS, the superheroes are just there to assist. The villains are also there, with Magneto being the only one to help out, and Dr. Doom just stares and sheds a tear. But more prophetically, though, Spidey confides in Captain America, who lived through the attacks on Pearl Harbor, and he gives Peter a warning that war is soon to come, and it did. Captain America was sent by Nick Fury to stop another terrorist attack in America, and Flash Thompson enlists to go fight in Iraq. But the biggest effect that the global war on terrorism had on comic books was with Marvel's Civil War. The event largely focused on the debate the real-world America was having at the time, freedom versus security. Captain America took the stand of the American ideals to protect civil liberties, while Iron Man saw no reason to indefinitely detain rebels in a parallel dimension. Neither side truly won, just like the real world when it comes to politics. Now that the global war on terrorism came to an end after 21 years, it's hard to truly place it within the typical cycles. It was enough time for a child to be born, grow up, and enlist to fight in the same war that they weren't even alive to see the start of. And yet, we still haven't seen too many mainstream takes on the war from an actual veteran's perspective. Sure, there are comic book collections like When I Returned, and the Terminal Lance comic strips of Maximilian Uriarty are some of the greatest voices of our generation of veteran, but they're still self-published. I have my ideas on why, but I can't even see the entire picture from where I'm standing. The rates at which people enlist in the military are drastically lower compared to where they once were, and even after 21 years of war, even today, the largest percentage of veterans alive are still the veterans from the Vietnam War. Not to mention that the barrier to entry into creative fields is drastically raising, and the folks who make it through that barrier usually come from economic backgrounds that don't typically need to enlist to get the GI Bill. Yet, our story is an important one to tell. I myself served in the US Army and deployed to Afghanistan. This video should be going up during Memorial Day weekend, and honestly, I can't think of a better way to truly honor the fallen than by hearing the stories of those who served with them. But seriously, thank you for watching today's video. What are your thoughts on how war has affected the comic book industry? If anything, I hope that I made my point that there's a certain level of authenticity that is felt by the fans when something is told by the veterans who fought in that war. And if anything, those veterans don't tend to glorify the horrors of war, but shine a light on the emotions and the trauma through our art. I would love to read your comments down below. And if you enjoyed today's video, please hit that like button. This video came from a place of love and is deeply personal for me. And of course, subscribe for more weekly content and comic books and nerd stuff. I've been Eric, and you've been awesome.